concepts and the issues and the problems in a way that is honest and accurate without stoking the polarization that we're all trying to kind of counteract. And so I think Dr. Geras does that, and he's brought together this excellent panel of diverse students and alumni. And so I will let him introduce them and kick it off.
Thanks, Magic. As Magic said, I'm Matt Geras. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Politics and International Affairs at UIS. And my role here today is really just to moderate a conversation about polarization with a group of current and or recent UIS or U of I students. And I'm just going to take a couple minutes here to introduce all of our panelists. And we'll just go left from right, and forgive me, I'm going to read bios because they've all accomplished quite a bit in a short period of time. So starting all the way on our left, we have Gabriella Hoxie, and she is currently in her first year as a graduate student with the UIS Legal Studies program. She received her Bachelor's of Art in both Political Science and Communication Studies from Loyola University in 2022. Following graduation, Gabriella began working as the deputy field director on the gubernatorial campaign for Richard Irvin. She subsequently went on to become the regional director of Cook and Lake counties for the Illinois House Republican Organization, where she directly oversaw 7 state representative races. Following the conclusion of the 2022 election cycle, Gabriella became a communications staffer with the office of the House Minority Leader in the Illinois General Assembly. In this role, she works directly with 3 state representatives on their communication and constituent outreach programs. Next, we have Amanda Temir-Young, and Amanda has been with UIS since 2019. She completed her bachelor's degree in political science with the School of Politics and International Affairs in August of 2022, and will complete her master's in political science in May of 2024. Amanda is also a GPSI intern at the Office of the Auditor General here in Springfield. Next, we have Caitlin Anderson. Caitlin graduated from Eureka College with a degree in History and Business Administration in 2019, and then completed a master's degree in political science at the University of Illinois Springfield in 2021. During her MA studies, she's focused on American government and elections, and she particularly had research interests in the effects of various election laws on voter turnout. Since graduation, she has worked in the Illinois General Assembly as a legislative coordinator in the Office of the Speaker. In this role, she assists members with policy creation, tracks legislation, and serves as support staff for several committees and the House Democratic Women's Caucus. Outside of the General Assembly, Caitlin is currently pursuing her MBA at SIUE. Next, we have Ken Ponquinette. Ken is a 25-year-old legislative coordinator for the Illinois House of Representatives with 7 years of experience in politics at the local, state, and campaign levels. Simultaneously, Ken has been a part-time student for 8 years and is set to graduate this December from UIS. Ken is engaged with various policy issues and is passionate about public service and policy development. Ken's unique blend of practical experience and academic dedication allow him to make meaningful impact in Illinois politics. Next, we have Dillon Williams. Dillon is a senior student at UIC, majoring in political science with a minor in Spanish. He has a passion for French baking and writing and wants to work in journalism after graduation, which I believe is also this year, planning for this year. Dillon is also currently taking a class on political polarization at UIC. So he's particularly well positioned to comment on how academics may view polarization slightly differently than some of the speakers we've heard from today or some of the frontline workers in politics that we'll hear from this afternoon. And then our final panelist is Dillon Santoni. And Dillon is pursuing his doctorate in public administration at UIS, focusing on education policy and workforce development. Outside of the classroom, he wears a couple of different hats, serving as the Deputy Director of Policy and Budget for the Illinois State Senate President, while also being in the U.S. Army Reserves as a drill sergeant. In his role in the Senate, Dillon oversees the policy and budget team and advises the members of the Majority Caucus on a wide range of policy and budgetary matters. Formerly, he served as the lead staffer for the Senate Veterans Affairs, Public Health and Education Committees. Dillon graduated with his bachelor's in political science from SIUE and his master's in political science from UIS. Dillon and his husband, Blake, reside in Springfield. So I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists for being here with us today. Many of them have gotten time away from their important jobs locally or class to be here with us today. And as I mentioned before, my role is really just to serve as a moderator here. So I've come up with a handful of questions that I've given them ahead of time to kind of think about. And then and beyond their responses to these initial questions, we'll open it to the up to audience questions if we have time as well. So my first question that I've asked the panelists is, the past 2 days, we've heard a lot about what politicians, the media, and researchers have to say about polarization. But let's now hear from current and recent students and how they've experienced polarization. And many of them, as I just mentioned, are working in politics on the front lines. So in the simplest terms, political scientists define political polarization as the growing distance between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Polarization can occur both in the context of our policy opinions and in the context of our feelings towards our own and especially the opposing political party and its leaders, which is what political scientists refer to as affective polarization. So now that I've just kind of provided the academic definition of what polarization is to political scientists, I'm going to ask our panelists, what does political polarization look like in your own experiences? To what extent have you felt the effects of political polarization in your daily academic, professional, and or personal lives? And this is open forum, so you're all welcome to comment, but whoever would like to go first can start off this conversation.
I'll go ahead and start at the end here. For me, I think political polarization, the way that I really view it is when people from kind of both extremes, so the far right and the far left, sort of speak on behalf of the entire party. That's something that I have dealt with a lot in my work, specifically more kind of campaigning versus what I'm doing now. My first job was, I don't know who followed the Republican primary election for governor, and it was incredibly polarized race. And jumping into politics, I kind of expected pushback from the opposing party. I mean, obviously, that's kind of how elections work, is they're against each other. What I did not expect was the level of animosity that came from within our own party. Even towards me, just somebody that was working on the campaign, and the things that were said to me by people who thought that, my candidate was not polarized enough. That was something that was really shocking, was kind of that divide, which kind of furthers this issue of polarization, I think, just every day when we see it. So that's kind of my experience with polarization. It was something that, like I said, was kind of unexpected. But just the inter-party polarization is, I think, something that's more prevalent, something that I kind of see day to day in what I do.
Okay. I guess I will go next since nobody else is jumping at it. When I was reading this question, because as Dr. Geras said, he gave it to us ahead of time, I really thought about how this presents in what we see in the General Assembly every day. And I came to the conclusion that I think about polarization and notice it the most in two different instances. The first is in how individuals and organizations interact with us as a government organization, and the other is in our policy creation. The former appears as this reluctance or inability that we have across the board, both coming from our side as the individuals within the General Assembly and those interacting with us, to accept that there are different worldviews and interact with those that may have them, and that we'd really prefer to just stay in our own in-group where not only are those views unchallenged, but they are constantly reaffirmed. I do see what Gabriella was saying as valid, that we do have a lot of it within our own party that's polarizing, but I do find that that tends to be more as opposing of the parties that you see that kind of polarization. The other way that I've seen it is this lack of being able to listen to a critique of legislation that you agree with, and lack of being able to listen to a defense of legislation that you disagree with. And that's where I really see it within our own party. I staff several different members, spanning one that is truly a progressive, one that is truly a moderate, and one that wavers back and forth. And seeing how they talk about each other's legislation to me, knowing that I'm listening to both sides, is really interesting in that they have a lot of hatred for things that at the core they agree with. But at the end of the day, it's really that I think about it more when I'm dealing with constituents and how they address me, and the things that they will say, going back to Gabriella's point, both your own party and the opposing party. But I will save further comments for later. Whoever wants to go next.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I think so. Okay. My name is Dillon. I'm an undergraduate student of political science in Chicago. I'm very happy that I'm here. Thank you guys for inviting students to come be a part of the forum. It's a huge opportunity. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm having fun. I've seen a lot of polarization. You know, some political scientists, they'll say that like polarization isn't as bad as other political science say that it is. I feel like it is bad though. I like see it all the time on campus with classmates as well as like in my family. My family's like all across the political spectrum. So 2016 was a pretty fun year for us. And 2017 and 2018 and 2019, you know. And so I see that like kind of worsening like extremes of opinion. And then even in school, a lot of students, like undergrad students, who want to like make a difference and stuff, they tend to have like an all or nothing policy, like I'm right, you're wrong, kind of polarized perspective on things. I've definitely noticed this with like class discussions on Israel. I'm a huge supporter of the Israeli state. Most of my classmates and my friends at school are not. And so you kind of see that polarization taking place. Republicans are kind of moving more towards it and the Democrats are like moving away. And yeah, we've had some pretty heated like discussions before in classes about that issue and other issues. So yeah, I do think polarization is getting worse. Yeah, I see it in my own personal life and at school, and that's kind of how it looks for me, I guess.
I also see polarization a lot in my personal life. You know, going off of the family, you know, big holidays, Thanksgiving, you know, we got multiple Thanksgiving dinners now. It's gotten to the point where having normal conversations with everyday people leads to contentious conversations. You know, you talk about football and, you know, in racism, and now you got a debate about should we be standing for the national anthem, and it's like, I just want to talk about football. And we've kind of lost that, but there was a time where, you know, if you wear Nike, you know, you represent something. I'm just wearing Nike. Folks, like different symbols, the Punisher logo represents the alt-right, and if you support the police, and you know, the flag represents something different to different people on the political spectrum, and even something beer, Bud Light now. You know, you've seen drinking a Bud Light. You know, people think you have a certain political affiliation based on the beer you're drinking. It's just gotten to the point where we can't even have, you know, normal interactions with our friends, with our families, without having to avoid conversations that we know are going to be contentious. You know, you're going out on a Friday night or just having lunch on a Wednesday afternoon, and you're talking about something that you used to talk about years ago that you could have a friendly conversation with, and now you end up saying, you know, I'm not going to talk to this person anymore because we clearly have different beliefs about what's going on.
Yeah.
Hey everyone. So I do agree with what they have just said about how polarization has really affected my personal life. I'm lucky to have, like, my whole family is all one party over the other, but for my mom, she always tells me, oh, my high school friends, these two best friends, they don't talk to each other anymore because one voted for Trump, one didn't, and now they're just totally across the country, not talking anymore. And my mom also, she's on Facebook a lot. I'm not on Facebook anymore. She had a friend's husband that was really, after he went through the steps of getting out of alcoholism, he fell into the like QAnon and other misinformation sphere of influence on Facebook, and she had to block him. But she, you know, still was able to communicate with him in person, just no politics spoken. I don't work in like legislative affairs or Congress here. I work at the Auditor General's office, so we try not to talk about politics at all. Or maybe they're just not talking to me about it because I've only been there for a year. But, you know, I'm a young 20-something-year-old girl, so I'm always on social media. I see a lot of this divide between people my age, people older, in between. And it's definitely getting worse. I don't think it's reached the point of no return, but I try not to engage with it as much. I do look at it quite a lot. And I talked to my husband about it, and he's like, Amanda, I do not care. I'm not American. Just, you know, that's your stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I guess, well, first I would agree with Amanda, Ken, and Dillon that we no longer talk about politics on dinner table. As our last 3 family gatherings, it's led to some discontent after that. So, but I guess putting a different kind of spin on this, I know that I think, you know, kind of looking around the room, there's a lot of faculty in the room, and what I think about is in this centrifuge that we all kind of know that we're in, where people are getting further apart, there seems to be a greater separation. Where the university serves is kind of the space, or what it's supposed to serve as a space where these ideas can kind of be both fleshed out, but additionally kind of a space for people that come from different backgrounds to explore kind of their thoughts. And I think what began commonly in my undergrad 10 years ago, you know, was that it seemed as though if you came with the unaccepted idea into this space, then oftentimes there wasn't an opportunity for you to kind of explore those ideas, and it may have been what you were taught, it may have been where you came from. And so I think the university serving as that kind of laboratory of diverse opinion and having that opportunity to kind of grow is really important. And I think sometimes the hyper polarized space that we live in today doesn't create that opportunity, and we kind of then find that people find a niche and they gather with their like-minded folks and they go to their corner, which then is no different than the university then is no different than the common space that people are in. So I would just kind of add, I know we'll talk about later kind of some solutions, but I think that that's kind of one of those spaces where a university kind of has that opportunity, especially as academics. You know, we're kind of expected to not take a given and kind of explore every idea. And so, so as a student, that's kind of been interesting to see how that's changed over time.
Thank you all for your opening thoughts and remarks on polarization broadly. My next question kind of asks you to think about polarization in your professional lives and your professional responsibilities. So as I mentioned before, many of our panelists work in positions that require them to interact with both elected politicians and voters on a daily basis. So let's take a closer look at polarization through the eyes of political staffers, which is not a group that we've necessarily heard from yet today. So do you feel as though political polarization is something that you all need to be mindful of as you carry out your day-to-day responsibilities? If so, how and what sorts of challenges does this present? And if not, why do you think we continue to hear so much about political polarization when we're paying attention to American politics? Although maybe it sounds like most of you do experience it in some form, so you can stick with either question.
I think I'm a senior right now, but junior year, I actually worked for an alderman for 8 months. I got course credit for it, and then like a paid internship over the summer. I worked in like the constituent service office, which is inherently like apolitical. You really want to keep constituent service people and like the campaign people like completely separate, right? So like if a constituent needs casework, if they need access to social work, they shouldn't be afraid of like, am I going to agree with their politics or not? But part of that, I would get a lot of calls about politics, and I think political polarization was really seen. It was kind of like people of like very, very polarized views just like getting angry and like calling in, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if I'm expressing myself very well. But yeah, I think it's definitely in government, especially since it's something you have to be really like careful with. Like you shouldn't talk about politics in that kind of environment. It can be difficult to figure out how to do that if some of the constituents are coming from that perspective.
I have the pleasure of staffing House members from Chicago, the west side of Chicago to be more specific. So on a day-to-day basis, I don't really have to worry about too much polarization on my end. At the end of the day, Illinois is a supermajority, so most of the stuff I do is going to cater towards the supermajority. Every once in a while, I do get a phone call from someone on the other side who is very upset with what's going on, and I try to hear them out as best as I can. But when they get angry and start using, you know, obscene words, that's when I draw the line and I hang up the phone. That being said, I think one of the reasons that polarization has gotten so bad in recent years is the 24/7 media cycle. At any given point in time, you can hop on Fox News or MSNBC and you're gonna listen to talking points that reinforce the views that you already have. I go to Planet Fitness and they got all the news stations up at the same time, and sometimes I just see the way MSNBC spins a news story while Fox News is spinning it, and you're getting two different narratives, and depending on what news you're watching and who you align with more, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's the truth right there. So you end up taking those talking points that you see Tucker Carlson, I know he's not on Fox News anymore, but you're taking these people and you're using them in your everyday life, when in reality, these media companies are there to make money. They're there to get views, so they're gonna talk about talking points that get those views and get those clicks.
Yeah, I kind of want to add on to that because a lot of what I do focuses specifically on communication. So I focused on that in undergrad, and my job now is primarily communications based. I have to say, I think that within traditional media, there's definitely an issue in terms of bias. And I even more specifically want to say, I think sometimes we see outlets will choose stories that are the most emotion evoking, like choosing things that about like really hot topic issues, you know, like gun legislation or like abortion access, something like that. And they don't cover issues like maybe a bipartisan bill to fund roads in Springfield. We don't see that happening, even though it does. And you know, last session there was plenty of bipartisan bills, but how many people in here can really name any of the bipartisan bills that went through last session? But you can probably talk about at least one or two of the controversial bills. So kind of, I think that there's a lack of covering those good things that are happening, first and foremost. And second, besides traditional media, social media, I think, has become a really big problem. Specifically on TikTok, something that I've noticed is the algorithm, I think, has a hard time placing what I am politically. So I'll get a more like liberal post, and if I like that liberal post, suddenly I'll have like a really far left post come up that I'm like, where did that even kind of come from? And same, like I'll like a more conservative post, and then it's like really far right, you know, something that I see, and I'm like, how did the algorithm get me here? And luckily, you know, I'm an adult, I can kind of decipher my own views, but my question is when there's, you know, 13, 14-year-old on TikTok seeing this kind of stuff, these people are now being radicalized online without understanding it. They don't have the media literacy to kind of parse through that. So I think for me, that's definitely a big concern. It's something that I see at work. I see it online. Running social media is a big part of what I do. So I see a lot of things just polarized on everything online, and it's unfortunate I don't have a solution to that issue necessarily without infringing on free speech, but I think it's definitely a big thing that we need to kind of talk about and focus on.
I'll go ahead and go. So I do agree with a lot of what my fellow panelists have said. And I'm actually, even though we're on the same staff, going to disagree with Kenny a little bit that I do think about polarization pretty much, at least during session, pretty much constantly. And it's really, it comes down to like two things for it. One is that I already mentioned that I have members that will contradict each other, like knowing that I'm going to go listen to both sides. But the other, and this is kind of like a weird take, is thinking about like staffer safety at the Capitol. Like after like we've seen an uptick in like political violence off of this polarization, probably because of the radicalization that Gabriella is talking about. And I'm part of our staff's team that has like taken trainings on like what we would do in case of like an active shooter. And really like sitting there and thinking about that, and then having one of my members this past session where we stopped answering her phone because she was getting death threats, and we weren't going to like listen to that, and we weren't sure how we were going to handle it, and that we had to like have Capitol Police on her cell phone as an like emergency contact for her. So that's the kind of political polarization. In terms of like what we're talking about up here, like where people disagree with their bills and stuff, I don't really think about that on a day-to-day basis. That's up to the members. I'm just here to file a bill or co-sponsor what they want. And if they want my opinion, I'll give it. But the only other time I think I really think about polarization in terms of my professional capacity is that I am on a team, and actually Kenny is on it with me, that we suggest events that the representatives can do. And one of the things we talk about is if an event is either too conservative or too liberal for a particular member, and if that should impact if we suggest it to the caucus as a whole.
I think the only thing I'll quickly add to this discussion, I think all the is it's a little bit of a perpetual cycle that we're all aware of. And as part of that perpetual cycle, at least in my job in the General Assembly, is how it hinders bipartisan cooperation by us being more polarized. And then that impedes legislation, which strains relationships between members. And that cycle, as it continues and often doesn't break because it's, the political kind of nature that we're in, really stifles growth and things of that nature when it comes to bipartisan cooperation. So that is probably the greatest challenge I recognize, is that we're in the cycle and somehow we have to find ways of breaking it. And I think to Gabriella's point, it is broken often, but we don't talk about those things because they're not the things to talk about for the media. But there are strains that are happening on the system because of the fact that we consider ourselves polarized to begin with.
So I'm a little bit different than everyone else, of course, since I work at a politically neutral agency of the state. I don't really think about political polarization in my professional life just because we don't talk about politics. There's no reason for us to talk about politics. We're just, collecting the data, we're writing a draft, and then we're sending it out into the world for no one to read. And going back to what you said, Gabriella said about TikTok, I've seen, my friends post stuff that was totally outrageous, like totally different than what they've done before in the past, like when I knew them in high school or undergrad. And going back to when I was an undergrad, I was a resident of Iowa at the time, so I'm not an Illinoisan, and I was a member of the poll worker staff, and we needed to have one Democrat at least and one Republican, and I was the Democrat with these two Republican older gentlemen. And even though we were on opposite sides of the party, this was it was 2020, so it was right during the pandemic. We were wearing the mask and everything. We got along. We didn't disagree about anything. We didn't talk about politics, even though sometimes they would make fun of me for being in school in Illinois and saying, "Oh, people up in Chicago are having dead people vote," which is, not true. But I can see that even with the state of political polarization and how it's getting worse, we can still work together when we just don't speak about politics or just recognize ourselves as fellow human beings.
Next, I want to discuss how studying political science or an associated field like public administration, history, or law has helped you to navigate the challenges of political polarization in your professional and educational lives. So my next question for you all has multiple parts. First, how has studying political science changed how you view political polarization and its corresponding challenges? And what specific lessons have you learned that have helped you to navigate the challenges of polarization? And then the second part of the question is, to what extent do you think these lessons are transferable to individuals who spend less time thinking about politics?
Well, I'll take this one first. Actually, this is my favorite question that you're going to ask today. Mostly because I never thought of it in this context. And I think that one of in political science, we often talk about a lot of nuances, and those nuances are the hardest part of this job, is trying to especially explain those to other people. But when you're talking about the historical context for things, when you're talking about political polarization, they all have this nuanced piece that goes beyond the surface level, and that's where a lot of struggle happens. And so I think when it comes to the transferability of some of the things that we've learned, some of the kind of high-level things that a lot of us have already talked about is effective communication, active listening. I talked about diverse viewpoints in the beginning. I think looking at those things and understanding them from a historical context where leaders have been successful in some of those things. We can talk about we all can point to some great leader that conveyed some amazing idea and see how all those elements were at play along the way. Additionally, I know Gabriella mentioned something that I've wrote down multiple times here, but is media literacy and promoting critical thinking and understanding that when you look at something, how it is that we got there. And a lot of political science programs today have courses around the media. Even this this summit had a panel earlier today about the media. I think that media literacy and how we focus on it as political scientists would be beneficial, of course, to the rest of kind of the electorate. Then I've never researched this, probably someone in the room, maybe yourself, Dr. Geras, that's looked at these things. I would bet that those that have studied political science are more civically engaged. And I think that is part of the reason is that, of course, we understand the impact of civic engagement, and thus we civically engage. And so I think if we could find ways of kind of bridging that information to the rest of the people, that would be really important in creating that kind of, fostering that agency, individual agency. And then I guess lastly, you know, a couple have already spoken about this, but there's a real impact of local politics that is not commonly talked about. It was all of the literature back in the 80s, 90s, where we understood local politics is all politics. But today we have this national trend that just kind of determines everything else down ballot. And so I think getting people to understand the impact of local politics would be really important.
All right, I think for me at UIC with like my political science courses, a lot of my professors have really like gone all in on creating an open forum and open debate, basically, because the schools have gotten a lot of criticism for like brainwashing kids, but it's actually the complete opposite. It's not really a problem, especially my constitutional law courses. I took 2 of those. They were very hard, but we were like forced to think of things in different perspectives and forced to make arguments for all these different things, regardless of what we might feel about it. And so I feel like my time at UIC with my political science curriculum, I think it's made me more tolerant. It's made me more moderate and like more patient, I think. Especially talking to someone who I really disagree with, I can vilify them, or I can just like take a step back and be like, okay, think of things differently, you know, nothing wrong with that. And then I think for individuals who spend less time thinking about politics, honestly, like in my own experience, I feel like the voters who go to all the rallies, they do all the protesting, they're very active, very engaged. A lot of them tend to be like the most uninformed voters like I've ever met, like ever. And I think, you know, having individuals who spend less time thinking about politics, I would argue that they can make more educated decisions when they vote because of the fact that they're not constantly like involved in politics. I think there are other ways that you can make smart choices on who you vote for, not just knowing policy. I don't think people really vote based on policy. I wish they did, but I don't think they really do. And so yeah, individuals who spend less time thinking about politics, they just tend to be not that polarized. And they tend to be a bit more accepting than people who are like super, super engaged. So I think we could take what they're doing and teach it to ourselves, I guess, rather than the other way around. It's kind of my way of looking at it.
So I agree with what Dillon just said at the very end. I found myself surrounded by friends that are mostly apolitical. So whenever they have a question, they're like, oh, Amanda, what does this mean? I'm like, okay, well, I can either give it to you how I see it personally or how, you know, a professor of political science would say it, or someone that's just totally neutral. I normally tend to do it neutrally because I don't want to sway their vote one way or another just by like forcing them to vote the way that I would vote. And I think it's just, we see that most individuals that aren't engaged in politics are not thinking about it most of the time if they're not like engaged with the news or engaged with people that are also super into politics, or just not, you know, they're in a math course, they don't think about politics. And I think, like Dillon said, we should try to apply it to ourselves.
Yeah.
Because then we wouldn't be so negative about things. We wouldn't be so like scared, I guess. I am, you know, nervous about political violence, but I don't work in a place that would have so much violence unless I went back to poll working. Then with more apathy, I guess, I don't want to say apathy, but with more apathy, maybe we'll see the threat of political violence go down. We should, of course, still be informed, but I don't think to this point where people are motivated to violence.
I'll use my experience personally being down in Springfield now. I'm from the suburbs near Chicago, and moving down to Springfield and having these open discussions with some of my classmates really opened my eyes about different opinions and perspectives about how we should be going about creating a better future for everybody. At the end of the day, I feel like we all really want the same thing. You know, we all want to, you know, work our jobs and provide for our families and ourselves as best we can, and want a government that's going to make that as easy as possible for us to do that. And it's just sometimes, you know, the way we want to go about doing that specific thing, we have vast different opinions on. And one thing I learned in my classes is always research your facts and cite your sources. It's gotten to the point now, especially in polarizing conversations, sometimes we get to debating opinions, and it's like, well, is that really a fact or is that just an opinion? And going back to critical thinking, you know, it's gotten to the point now where sometimes folks are taking their opinions like, no, that's a fact. And I think that's because we lack critical thinking and media literacy to figure out when the media is telling us an opinion, like the difference between an op-ed and, you know, someone who's actually redoing research and, you know, citing their sources behind something. I agree that, you know, I do think we should be a little bit more, I don't want to use apathetic either, but, you know, just a little bit less more contentious about, you know, our ideologies and I guess the things that trigger us regarding our ideologies, and sometimes just take a step back to maybe do some more research on a perspective you're not fully aware on. You know, there could be something you're very passionate about that, you know, that aligns with your ideology that you just don't know all the facts about, and if you were to read more about it, and I'm not saying it's going to change your opinion about it, but at least you'll be able to understand why other folks feel differently.
So I'm actually going to build off of this idea that, you know, critical thinking is the way out of this, and that it's not just critical thinking, it's also how to handle that communication with the other person, or other people, depending on the situation. One of the things that I found a lot in my research, even though it was on voting law rather than polarization specifically, although there's an argument to be made that most voting law is polarized, is that almost everybody overestimates their own understanding and knowledge of a situation and underestimates the opposing party or opposing person's understanding of that same situation. So being able to communicate your ideas clearly and calmly and ask for where somebody sees a argument there and being able to listen and respond in that same manner is equally as important as being able to articulate, as to form your own arguments in your own head, and as to how that's a transferable skill. Communication is good in all fields. I don't have much more to add.
I think I kind of have a little bit of a different take on this question. For me personally, I think since I started kind of this program and more in academia, it's actually made me a little bit more hopeful that there is a solution to the polarization. I think before, when you're kind of in campaign mode, it genuinely seems like the whole world is against you. But when you kind of take a step back, you get out of that like emotional state, and you kind of look at something and say, okay, these are the reasons why this is happening. Here are some solutions to the problem. It's a lot more hopeful than, you know, I feel like people on both sides use a lot of like hyperbole with saying like the democracy is literally going to end this election, or, you know, the country is so divided. Like, I think sometimes it's a lot harder to step back, but when you look at it through an academic lens, I think that it presents a lot of viable solutions to the problem that when you're in the heat of the moment, when you're emotional and upset about what's going on, it can be harder to see those. So I think, is that transferable to the public? I think so. I think it's just a matter of communicating it in a way that people understand that there are solutions, instead of just saying over and over and over how divided things are, also presenting like, okay, well, here's one way that we can kind of fix that problem.
Thanks, Gabrielle. That's a really great segue to my last pre-planned question, which is about solutions to polarization. And given all of your unique perspectives of both studying political science and working in practical politics, often at the same time, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you what might be done about political polarization. So first, do you all view our current state of political polarization as something that is normal and perhaps even inevitable in politics? Or do you agree with many recent assessments by political scientists and others, some of which we heard today and last night, that political polarization has reached a crisis point? In either case, based upon your own experiences, what, if any, can and should be done to mitigate or reduce polarization in American politics?
I think like polarization is important. It's important to disagree. Like we talked about, the first newspapers were ran by the political parties. But now when you have a former president trying to steal the election and overturn Georgia's results, I think that's a good sign that polarization is kind of reaching a breaking point right now. And there's a few solutions I would think of. The first one would be like media literacy is really important. I didn't learn how to like look up news until I started like freshman year of college, where we have to take 2 semesters of academic writing. Now professors and the librarians were teaching us how to check sources, how to look at who wrote the article, are they qualified, how do you watch the news? There's different things for you to look for. So I think having like academic writing maybe be like a high school thing instead of a college thing, teaching people those sources earlier on, I think would be a good idea. The second reform I would say would have to be with voting. So right now there's each state in America like has their own voting process. The Democratic Party is kind of unified across states, but with the Republican Party, it's completely different elections within each state. I think if we were to have a national standard, I don't want the federal government to control elections because you run the risk of corruption, but I think, especially with people being so afraid of voter fraud and like fake votes, if we were to have like a standard system in each state on how like voting works and how you choose the politicians that you want in office, I do think that would create more trust in the election system, and I think that could help decrease polarization a little bit, at least on that point.
I think that the current level of polarization and the trend that it's going is unsustainable. Regardless of the words you want to use, we did have a group of individuals try to storm the Capitol after our latest presidential election. Personally, I think, I agree that media literacy and, learning how to do research is very important, but I think that the correlation between the income gap and polarization can't be denied, and I truly believe that until something is done to address that income gap, that it's only going to get worse. Because when people are, it's like crabs in a barrel. We're all fighting each other over small things when we need to be fighting together over something that's really messing over us all, and that's these big corporations being greedy and hiking up prices and keeping wages low.
I think something from my other hat that I wear, I've been in the Army for about 12 years, and if anything, when you get a bunch of Army people together with nothing to do, it's always bad ideas. But a lot of people in the uniform disagree with me on politics, just the nature of who serves in the military. And one thing that I found is, that I think is really important, and I have a lot of respect for those in the military that I've had these conversations with, is whenever you encourage these open, kind of respectful, empathetic conversations, something comes out. And what is true a lot of the time is that as soon as you humanize the other person that it is that you're talking to, oftentimes you can come to some sort of an actual conversation that feels like, and that often is like genuine, and that you're trying to find some sort of bottom line, some sort of ground of which you can compromise and agree. But as many have talked about, the humanization factor, I think, is what often lacks when we talk about people, when we talk about issues, is that we all share kind of a common basis, and if that becomes kind of the principle, if everyone walks into the conversation with that, a lot of times it changes the dynamic of that conversation. And I've found that to be true in the Army. I found that to be true in the Capitol. I work great with a lot of my colleagues across the aisle, but a lot of times it's the fact that I know their kids, and that I know their parents, and that I know their birthday. So I think that those things are important to think about too when we go into those conversations.
So, Dillon, you just sort of stole like everything that was on my page. So, congrats. But I guess I'll add to that when you humanize everybody, because I do think that is also the solution here, is that it becomes a lot easier to get out of your echo chamber if you acknowledge that everybody around you is a human and they have their own thoughts and that they are just trying to do the best that they can by themselves or their families 99% of the time. I will allow that, some people are out here just to cause chaos, but most of the time they're really just out here trying to do the best that they can, and if you can go at it from that perspective, it's a lot easier to step into their shoes and see where you might have blind spots that would make your policy better, or why you maybe shouldn't be pursuing that goal. So, other than that, I just concur on everything that Dillon said.
I want to kind of agree with specifically the word that Ken used. He said it was unsustainable. I definitely agree it's unsustainable. I think that it's not necessarily at the point where it's unfixable, but I think that just the rate that it's going is unsustainable. Personally, I think I have 3 big areas that I think could be potential solutions for this. The first is campaign finance reform. I think we see a lot of times candidates are able to buy their way into a seat. I think that's a huge problem, and I think also just the way that, if the candidate has their own funding, they can buy themselves a seat, or who they are being funded by, depending on if it's a PAC, sometimes they may be forced into more radical ideas because that's where their funding is coming from and they need the money. Second, another one that's huge, I think, is gerrymandering. I think we saw a lot of the results from the last remapping in our state in the last election. One perfect example of this is if you look at, there's a congressional seat in Illinois where we had 2 Republicans grouped into 1 seat, and the very extreme one beat out the moderate candidate because of the way that the district was kind of shaped. And so then we lose a moderate voice in Congress because of that. And that's an issue. Both political parties do this all across the country. It's definitely an issue. The third one is primary elections. Kind of going off what I just said, I think we see primaries tend to draw out the most engaged citizens, which tend to also be the most radical people. And then we see the more moderate candidates are kind of pushed to the back because they're not screaming from the rooftops with their views. So those are kind of my 3 things. I think that these are all fixable. I don't necessarily have a specific idea. I think the issue with a lot of these is passing legislation can kind of infringe on free speech or things of that nature. So it's hard to regulate these issues. But I think all of them are possible to be changed.
So I agree with what everyone has been saying. I've been trying to come up with points that are not the same. But I do agree that some of the most basic solutions that we could have is just teaching media literacy and just critical thinking in not undergrad, but high school level, so that you go into the university or wherever you go in life after high school with these skills to be able to do your own research and such. And going back to what people have said about voting process and primary elections, coming from Iowa, we have the caucuses. No one likes them. The Democratic Party has, they're stepping back from being first in the nation, but the Republican Party is still doing their own caucus. And those caucuses are not run the same at all. So with the Democrats, you have more of an open forum. With the Republicans, I believe it's just putting a vote in a hat, and then from there they count it up. And I agree with what everyone has said before. It's unsustainable. This political polarization is reaching a crisis point, but there is still hope, as Gabriella said, of just finding a solution where people that are not politically literate like we are as political science students and people that work in politics can find. And just in my experience in undergrad, I worked as an intern and then as a manager for this website company where they took all the news sources, news stories, and we rated it for how conservative it is to how liberal it is, so that people can have access to different viewpoints and see how this article is rated and how this article is rated and compare the 2 narratives.
Thanks. I think we have time for one quick audience question. But before I turn it over to an audience member, I just want to say I think in the past 40 minutes, our student and alumni panelists have hit on every theme of all of the other panels for this conference. So I think that's a really good sign that we're discussing having the right conversations this weekend. So does anyone have a question for Dean Smith?
Let me just echo that sentiment. First of all, Matthew mentioned thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you about not standing and thank you now. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. If you were to look ahead, let's say in 3
Yeah, I think that there is a chance for improvement, and if I'm going to be very honest, I think it kind of depends who the Republican candidate for president is, kind of determining where that's going. I think that's a huge factor, but I think it could be great and it could be not so great.
I do agree with that. I think it depends on who is the Republican candidate. And I think sometimes things will get worse before they get better, but in the end, they always do get better.
I guess I will also concur on that. The president election will have a lot of sway on that, but I will actually say that if nothing changes, particularly at the national level, I think that we're headed for it to get worse.
I'm gonna be idealistic. I'm gonna say that it's gonna get better, hopefully.
Thank you for being the idealist. We need more people. Speaking on pessimism, 3 years from now, I think it depends on whether or not we're at war with Iran in the next 3 years. There's a lot of things that could be happening, and it's kind of scary. I try to be more idyllic, but yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think it's kind of a big shift in America right now.
It'll be the same.
I may get in trouble for extending this out one more question, but I saw a couple other hands. So Dr. Theriol, do you want to ask a question?
And mine is really easy and one word answer again. Is your generation the solution to this problem, or is your generation going to exacerbate it?
I would love to say that we're the solution. However, I do think that our generation specifically is incredibly, incredibly passionate about politics, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm just going to say that I think our passion maybe can drive us to a solution, but that's just maybe me being biased. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that our generation can maybe present a really good solution, or maybe we could just continue the trend, but I hope, for the best.
I'll join Kenny on the idealism here. We're the solution.
I'll say, I think our generation, especially over the past couple elections, has shown their passion for politics and getting involved, and hopefully that bodes well for them.
Yeah, I do think we're the solution. It's just not something that's going to happen in the near future. But I think the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, when we're the ones in elected office, when we're the judges, we're the immigration judges, we're the lawyers, we're the politicians, I think we're going to kind of look at all this polarization and have that in our minds of what it looked like and say, okay, let's not do that. I think that it's not going to happen soon, but it will happen in the long term.
Well, I guess this assumes that we're in a different generation. But
Oh, we are, my friend.
I would say, I think innovation without regulation is disaster, and our generation has a habit of innovating. I mean, it's a great thing, but at the same time, the people regulating are so disconnected from the innovation that it could be disastrous. So to your question, I'm not sure if our generation is going to be better at that, being as though we're going to step into the role and we're going to be the ones regulating innovation that we could have never imagined. But I do think that generations prior had that easier when innovation was slower. And so maybe, but I think that as long as we don't understand kind of the innovations happening behind us, we will always end up kind of in this cycle.
Thank you, everyone. I apologize if anyone still had questions. Maybe you can talk to our panelists either during the short break or the rest of the day, although many of them may have to get back to work. I've already told our panelists this, but I'll say it to the larger group here. I think this group, both collectively and individually in their individual roles and responsibilities, are a great reflection of the work that we do at UIS and the larger U of I system. So I just, again, want to thank our panelists for being with us today. Thanks.